All right, we're going to have a brief discussion about the Holocaust. You can look at page 13 in your notes. So, yeah, a lot to talk about, but we just don't have time to get into everything. So here's a map of the camps, or some of the more famous camps, or infamous camps, rather. So the death camps you see have a skull and crossbones, then concentration camps, which are more work camps, have the swastika. So here up here, Bergen-Belsen, that's I believe where Anne Frank died. Ravensbrück, that's Corrie ten Boom was there. Buchenwald, I think you saw that in the Holocaust video that I put up a day or two ago. Dachau, another famous camp. Then looking at death camps, you got Treblinka. We'll talk about that. Sobibor, Auschwitz, Birkenau, Buna, here in Poland. So we're going to look at a couple of Holocaust survivors. So this is from a couple different sources. One is Primo Levi, The Drowned and the Saved. Levi was an Auschwitz survivor, wrote several books. And the other is from Elie Wiesel, who's another survivor. And these are just quotes. So we're going to get to that in just a second. So the general procedure. So what they did is the Germans decided, because of Hitler's Mein Kampf, etc., and the Nazi Party, to kill off the Jews. And we talked weeks ago about how they started out gassing them and shooting them into trenches, and they still did that, but eventually they evolved their practice into bringing Jews to death camps. And so they would round Jews up and put them on trains, and they'd stack them in there like cattle, so close together that people actually died on the trains because the conditions were so horrible, for days and days without food or water, no place to go to the bathroom. Some Jews they rounded up and put in ghettos. Some famous ghettos are like or infamous ghettos are like the Warsaw Ghetto. So I put a reading up on Moodle for that. And a ghetto is just where basically a neighborhood that the Germans would block off and force all the Jews into there as they waited for deportation to death camps. So the general procedure is they load you up on these trains, and days would go by before you would arrive at a camp. So let's say Auschwitz, and you would get off the train onto a platform, and immediately you would be separated based on if you had any value to the German war machine. So they would divide you, the men, young adults, men, anyone who looked like they had some strength and ability was separated to go to the work camp. And then if you were a young child or very elderly or sickly, or a lot of moms they found out that it's very difficult to part a mom from her baby or her very young child, and so mothers with their young children and other weaker people were separated out immediately to go to the gas chambers. Now obviously they didn't tell these people that are going to the gas chambers. They would tell them they needed to be cleaned, showered, deloused, whatever, and they would strip them down, or the people would take off their clothes and go into these big rooms, hundreds of people at a time, and with the idea that they would be basically showered down from being filthy on the train. And that kind of makes sense. And then instead of showering them down, etc., they would put in this poisonous gas called Zyklon B, that would kill people within a matter of minutes. And then at that point, you had this group of Jews, special group of Jews called the Sonderkommando, and their horrible job was to take the people from the gas chambers and cut their hair, pull out their gold teeth, etc., before loading them up into these massive ovens called the crematoriums, where they would burn the body into ashes. And then the people in the work camp would basically work until they were too weak to continue to work or got sick from, malnourishment, etc. And then they would go to the gas chambers as well. Now, before they developed gas before in camps like Treblinka, for example, they would just bury, they would, before they developed the crematorium, they would gas people and then they would just put them in these mass graves, but they couldn't dig graves fast enough for the thousands upon thousands of Jews and others that they were killing. And so they started experimenting with burning bodies, and they tried different ways of stacking bodies, and they made it like a science, like what's the best way to stack bodies to burn them. And they found out, women have a higher natural fat content than men. So, put dead women's bodies on the bottom and how much wood you needed and accelerants, and it just horrible. And eventually they developed crematorium, these massive ovens to burn the bodies. Millions would die this way. So that's the general procedure. They also did experiments on the Jews. You heard about that a bit in the video. Dr. Mengele, they called him the angel of death. He did a lot of experiments. He would put Jews in freezing cold water to see how cold or how low he can get their body temperature and still revive them, as a study of like, what, could they use this to save down German pilots or sailors who were hypothermic. That he put acids and all kinds of things on people's eyes, just all kinds of human experimentation. He did nasty things to twins, and trying to figure out how to have genetic engineering to have people have more twins so that Germans could make more Nazis. So that's the general idea here, with these camps. And why didn't the Jews revolt? There were some revolts. So the article I put on Moodle on the Warsaw Ghetto is that revolt. There was a revolt in Auschwitz where they blew up one of the crematorium. There was a revolt in Treblinka that wasn't that successful. One of the things that students often struggle with is, like, why didn't these Jewish people, why didn't they all band together and overrun the camp or fight their way to freedom or whatever the case may be? Why would they just work themselves to death and die in misery? I think the thing that we're forgetting is that I think it was Primo Levi, when he was describing what it's like to be in one of these camps, he said, basically, when they starve you to death, or they starve you to, you're living in starvation, and you're put in a camp, it's not like it's all people that you know, right? It's people from all different nationalities. They might not speak your language, etc. He says, basically, your mind goes into like an animalistic state. You lose the ability to be rational. And if you do any sort of study of people who are starving to death, you will find that their mind is not working correctly. It turns men into animals, where food becomes the only thing that they can think about. And so it's not like you have these well-fed, logical, rational people who can contemplate their decisions. It's basically you're in a survival mode where your body is eating itself to try to exist. And so your thought is only about how do I eat and survive. You're not thinking about how to revolt and having all these upper level rational thoughts. Primo Levi argued that's why there were so few suicides in the death camps, because suicide takes rational thought. And these people were reduced to irrational behavior, survivalist behavior. They were not capable in that condition of organizing mass revolts against the Germans. So that's his thought anyway. Although, as I said, there were some revolts. Okay, so just go through some quotes here from a couple of survivors, just to give us some thoughts from books they wrote. So this is, like I said, from The Drowned and the Saved by Primo Levi and Elie Wiesel's Night. So there's not a prisoner who does not remember this and who does not remember his amazement. At the time, the first threats, the first insults, the first blows came not from the SS, but from the other prisoners, from colleagues. They called them capos. Capos? From these mysterious personages who nevertheless wore the same striped tunic that they, the new arrivals, had just put on. So maybe you've seen that kind of striped tunic that they would wear, black and white bars. But the capos were Jews who were given special privileges by the Germans to keep other Jews in line. And they often did this with violence. At no place or time has one seen a phenomenon so unexpected and complex. Never have so many human lives been extinguished in so short a time, and with so lucid a combination of technological ingenuity, fanaticism, and cruelty. So the Enlightenment thinkers thought that men were going to use, men and women were going to use all kinds of scientific knowledge and medicine, etc., to make the earth a better and better place. And here the Germans used the best minds in scientific knowledge to find out how to kill people the most efficiently. So it's like the antithesis of the Enlightenment. Anyone who has been tortured remains tortured. Anyone who has suffered torture never again will be able to be at ease in the world. The abomination of the annihilation is never extinguished. Faith in humanity, already cracked by the first slap in the face, then demolished by torture, is never acquired again. So there's a brokenness for survivors that can never be healed. Why do you do this? Were you aware that you were committing a crime? In the end, they, Stengel, Haas, Eichmann, Speer, etc., all say the same things. I did it because I was ordered to. Others, my superiors, have committed acts worse than mine. In view of the upbringing I received and the environment in which I lived, I could not have acted differently. Had I not done it, another would have done it even more harshly in my place. So these are the kinds of excuses that we heard in the Nuremberg trials for Nazi war criminals. And people were like trying to understand. These Germans kept saying, we're just following orders. We weren't really that bad. And Levi says his response to that, for anyone who reads these justifications, the first reaction is revulsion. An extreme case of collaboration is represented by the Sonderkommandos of Auschwitz. Here one hesitates to speak of privilege. Whoever belonged to this group was privileged only to the extent that, but what a cost. He had enough to eat for a few months, certainly not because he could be envied. It was their task to run the crematoria, to go into gas chambers, to extract the corpses from the chambers, to pull gold teeth from jaws, to cut women's hair, to sort and classify clothes, shoes, and contents of the luggage, to transport the bodies to the crematoria and oversee the operation of the ovens, to extract and eliminate the ashes. So the Germans, in a sick ingenuity, didn't want to be the ones who were moving dead Jewish bodies to gas chambers, or from gas chamber to oven. So they forced Jews to do it. And these Jews were called the Sonderkommando. So the Sonderkommando were made up largely of Jews. It must be Jews who put Jews into the ovens. It must be shown that Jews, the sub-race, the sub-men, bow to any and all humiliation, even to destroying themselves. So one of the classic things the Germans did was blame the victims. They treated the Jews horribly, and they said, like, what kind of person would put their own kind into an oven from a gas chamber? Germans would never, the true Aryans would never do this to each other. That's the kind of faulty, sick logic the Germans used. I believe that no one is authorized to judge them, not those who lived through the experience of the lager or the work death camps, and even less those who did not. I would invite anyone who dares pass judgment to carry out upon himself with sincerity a conceptual experiment. Let him imagine, if he can, that he has lived for months or years in a ghetto, tormented by chronic hunger, fatigue, promiscuity, and humiliation, that he's seen die around him one by one his beloved, that he is cut off from the world, that finally he is loaded onto a train, 80 or 100 persons to a boxcar, that he travels into the unknown blindly for sleepless days and nights, and that he is at last flung inside the walls of an indecipherable inferno. In other words, don't judge these people for what happened. So Levi really struggled in The Drowned and the Saved with how a lot of people who survived the death camps were not nice people. They did things. They stole food from other people. They did whatever it took to survive. And a lot of the wonderful, kind people who would give up their food or stick up for other people, they were killed. And so he really struggled with that. And he said, but you can't judge the survivors unless you went through it yourself, because what they went through was impossible. My hands hurt. I was clenching them so hard. This is switching to Elie Wiesel now. Oh, to strangle the doctors and the others, to burn the whole world, my father's murderers, but the cry stayed in my throat. And then here the author speaking of his train ride to Buchenwald, from Auschwitz to Buchenwald. They were not fed for 6 days. The soldiers began tossing into cattle cars, bread into cattle cars, just to watch the starving Jews fight to the death for crumbs. I noticed an old man dragging himself on all fours. He was trying to disengage from the struggle. He held one hand to his heart. I thought at first he had received a blow to the chest. Then I understood. He had a bit of bread under his shirt. With remarkable speed, he drew it out and he put it in his mouth. His eyes gleamed. A smile like a grimace lit on his dead face, and he was immediately extinguished. The shadow had just loomed up near him. The shadow threw itself upon him, fell to the ground, stunned with blows. The old man cried, Mir, Mir, my boy, don't you recognize me? It's your father. You're hurting me. You're killing your father. I've got some bread for you too, for you too. He collapsed. His fist was still clenched around a small piece. He tried to carry it to his mouth, but the other one threw himself upon him and snatched it. The old man, again whispering something, let out a rattle and died amid the general indifference. His son searched him, took the bread, and began to devour it. He was not able to get very far. 2 men had seen and hurled themselves upon him. Others joined in. When they withdrew, next to me were 2 corpses, side by side, the father and the son. I was 15 years old. So Elie talks about witnessing a son murder his father for a piece of bread, and then the son being murdered. And this is the kind of reality that was the death camp experience. The last day had been the most murderous for the train ride from Auschwitz to Buchenwald. 100 of us got to the wagon, a dozen of us got out, among them my father and I. Some other stories here. So basically, Elie Wiesel went to the death camp with his father, and they survived Auschwitz, and they had a decision to make about whether to stay or go before the Russians came. And they thought the Russians would kill them all, or the Germans would kill everyone in the camp before the Russians got there. So they left with the Germans, and then Elie's father ends up dying before liberation. So if they had stayed, they would have survived, but they didn't, of course, know that. So I'm not going to read every one of these. He just kind of gives these stories about, the difficulty of caring for his father. Here, this one about the Day of Atonement. Elie Wiesel, obviously a Jew, believed in God, but when he went to Auschwitz, he gave up his faith, at least during that time, because he couldn't understand why the Jews, God's chosen people, would be treated this way. And so he, instead of the Day of Atonement, it was when you were supposed to repent of all your sins from the previous year, and he didn't do that because he felt like he was accusing God because God had gone against the Jewish people, which is really blasphemous. But he's being honest for how his faith was gone. This is about a young boy who was hung. How his dad was beaten by a capo. Remember, these were capos were Jews who were very violent that the Germans used to control the Jewish population, and how he was angry at his father for not just doing what he was supposed to do, instead of being angry at the capo who was beating his father with an iron bar. So then this is where the title of the book comes. So, not far from us, flames were leaping up from a ditch, gigantic flames. They were burning something. A lorry drew up at the pit and delivered its load. Little children, babies. Yes, I saw it with my own eyes, those children in the flames. A little farther on was another larger ditch for adults. My father was weeping. His body was shaken convulsively. Around us, everyone was weeping. For the first time, I felt revolt rise up in me. Why should I bless his name? The eternal Lord of the universe, the all-powerful and the terrible, was silent. What had I to thank him for? Never shall I forget that night, the first night in camp, which has turned my life into one long night. 7 times cursed and 7 times sealed. Never shall I forget that smoke. Never shall I forget the little faces of the children whose bodies I saw turn into wreaths of smoke beneath a silent blue sky. Never shall I forget those flames which consume my faith forever. Never shall I forget that nocturnal silence which deprived me for all eternity of the desire to live. Never shall I forget those moments which murdered my God and my soul and turned my dreams to dust. Never shall I forget these things, even if I'm condemned to live as long as God himself. Never. So yeah, you can imagine a young boy sees all these terrible things and can't imagine God allowing this to happen and losing his belief. And so it's an opposite experience of what Corey and Betsy went through from the hiding place, or a different experience, right? Because in their concentration camp experience, it strengthened their faith. And they did feel God's presence even in the dark, sinful place that was Ravensbrück. And yeah, so you see the terrible reaction from Elie Wiesel here, that how he turned his back on God in the midst of this terrible suffering. And a week went by. My father was also talking about the death of his father, and how he felt freed because it took so much of his time and energy to care for his father. So that's just briefly going through some different parts of these books and things that they suffered through.